Welcome to the lecture video that makes me feel ancient as the Egyptian pyramids, otherwise known as the pop culture of my youth. Because y'all, I was born in the year 1992, which for those of y'all that are bad at generational math, makes me one of those darn millennials that you hear about in the news all the time. You know, the people who are always killing off very parts of the economy and complaining that the ice caps are melting and eating weird things on toast. But in the 90s, I was busy doing things like wearing mismatched windbreaker suits and wearing out VHS tapes. Oh my gosh, y'all don't even know what that means probably. So buckle up, because in this lesson, we're going to discuss all of the things that made the era of my youth better than the era of everyone else's youth. Because the 90s were truly the best time to grow up, which yes, is why millennials are currently fighting it out with the baby boomers for the most insufferable generation in modern American history. The late 20th century is usually referred to as the information age because of a massive boom in the exchange of information that came with improved technology and things like transportation, but more importantly, with the creation of things like computers and the internet. Now, modern computers have existed in some form since about World War I, when code breakers used them to decrypt messages. But these devices were used for very specific purposes, and the machines required human counterparts to input specific information into them in order to get out an equally specific outcome. Before this, these calculations had to be done by groups of people who were themselves referred to as computers because they did mathematical computations. When the equations were moved over to machine calculators, those machines were massive and took up the size of entire rooms. It wasn't until the 80s that companies like Apple and IBM started making personal computers for average households. But even then, these computers were limited in what they could do, and most required a lot more knowledge of the inner workings of computer science than the computers that we use today. Most were used for business functions like creating documents and spreadsheets, and could only really be used to search for something like something else when someone knew exactly what they were looking for. The internet was created in the 1970s for military use by the Department of Defense. At the time, they thought that it would be a good idea for scientists and military officials to be able to access one computer from another computer at another location, even if that was far away. And so initially, the term internet was literally a network of computers that were interdispersed across the DoD's various locations. People with the right credentials could search information on any of the computers from one of the other computers in that network. And this was the way that it stayed until the mid-80s. In 1991, the internet as we know it experienced its first real change. It opened to the world as essentially a place for academics and other people with important information to share that information. But even then, the look of it was essentially just a database of text-based web pages with hyperlinks to more text-based web pages. The first picture didn't even make an appearance until the next year. In 1993, the internet opened more widely to anyone interested in posting on it, and it opened for free. With this also came the first web browsers, so people could actually use the tool, like Netscape and the original version of Internet Explorer. From our map here, we can see the massive growth in internet capabilities from its very first release to the public in 1991 to just over half a decade later in 1997. Importantly, people who criticize the internet and its growth argue that, like many other forms of technology, it only worked to increase divides between the rich and the poor. And since the internet's main purpose was information, especially the spread of new information, this only furthered the gap between nations who could put that information to use faster and those who couldn't. Nations who had the ability to apply the internet would also have the ability to implement any critical information they learned from it, thus furthering their society even more. Meanwhile, societies that were behind enough to not take advantage would fall further and further behind. The internet's less personal and semi-anonymous nature also brought criticisms and skepticism from groups who wondered how governments like the US would handle issues dealing with free speech. How would things like hate speech or threats be handled when they were done over a screen? In many ways, these and other issues are still things that the US federal government deals with as the aftermath of the internet's exponential growth. One of the things that the federal government is currently dealing with is the fast growth and virtual domination of tech companies like Google. Today, Google is both a noun and a verb. It's a company and the term we use to describe searching for something online. And when you consider that Google has only existed since 1998, the fact that their company has already fundamentally changed the American lexicon is extremely impressive. When it was created, Google made it easier to search for things on the internet. Before this, people had to use a variety of search engines depending on what they were looking for. Think of it almost like using the library's databases when you're doing a research paper. Because remember, remember, when the internet was first created, it was a database of articles, and so people would have to input search terms to find the thing that they were looking for. What Google did was essentially search across these databases and compile what you needed based on how important it thought the pages were to what you searched for. Over time, Google also added advertising and compiled other aspects like video, images, and a variety of other things. Today, they're a tech giant with hands in a lot of different things. And this is where the problem lies, at least from the government's perspective. Because the tech boom happened so fast, the government now has to look at antitrust laws and decide if companies like Google have too large a share in advertising, or if Facebook has absorbed too many companies and needs to break apart. One of the most profound changes that came with the internet was that it changed the way that people communicated. With the creation of the internet came things like electronic mail or email, and eventually instant messaging. Probably the most widely used version of instant messaging in the 90s and early 2000s was AOL's AIM Instant Messenger. As you can see here on the left, you'd have a chat box where you would chat with your friends using screen names, although the example text here is the most formal looking text I've ever seen. Now, the reality of this is that people, young people at least, spent probably more time on AIM picking out their username and away message than actually chatting with people. Because you wanted your username to make it obvious who you were, but you didn't want it to just say your name. That would be lame. So you had to come up with something with identifying factors that were also funny or cute or slightly edgy. And that's just when you're actually talking to someone. When you weren't at your computer, you wanted to have an away message that would pop up when people tried to message you. Now, keep in mind that AIM was originally created for business people, so in theory, you're supposed to be writing things like, in a meeting, be back at 1 p.m. But since we were all kids and teens, we spent a quality amount of time crafting the perfect away message so that when people looked at ours, they knew exactly the kind of person we were in about 5 seconds. Think of this like your Twitter or Instagram bio. So we'd spend 3 hours choosing between the 10 available fonts and maybe 15 colors of text and background, and then you had to actually pick what it was going to say. So on our example here, you've got your traditional inspirational quote genre, "Don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened." So I immediately know that this chick just broke up with someone. Now, personally, mine were pretty much always Avril Lavigne lyrics, rotating based on the week. One of my friends who was trying to build up some muscle but was also a giant nerd set his to out pumping Fe, TTYL, Fe being the periodic symbol for iron, for those of you not doing hot in science. And this might seem like a lot of effort, and I won't lie, it was, but one, we also weren't out re-recording TikToks 50 times a day, and two, most critically, we didn't have text messaging, at least not reasonably, because for the vast majority of my youth, we had to pay for text per text message, 10 cents per normal text and about 25 cents per image, and heaven forbid you accidentally hit that button that activated the internet. And for a lot of the time, we also had to pay for talking on our cell phones per minute too. So when we had this option to chat with each other back and forth without having to ask someone to drive us to a friend's house or walk all the way over there, we grabbed onto it. Most people also jumped pretty quick onto social media, although perhaps not to the degree that they do today. The first real social media site that we acknowledge is one called 6 Degrees, like the sociological concept of 6 degrees of separation. This site had a bit of a following, but didn't blow up like the rest of the ones that followed it, especially in the 2000s, because it actually required people to send their friends an invitation in order to join, at least in the early years. The next major social media site to hit the web was Xanga. I'm not ashamed to admit that I totally had one of these. Xanga was kind of a mix between a blog and a traditional social media platform. So you could upload photos and stuff almost like Facebook, but you'd also treat it kind of like a blog or a diary. And you can invite your friends to follow your Xanga page. I was in the 8th grade when I got my Xanga and was definitely not allowed to have a social media yet, and then got busted by my parents, so mine did not last too long. And really, the platform itself was pretty quickly replaced by MySpace in 2003, which was way cooler anyway because you could rank your friends in order of importance and create total social chaos by downgrading somebody on your top 8. Man, what a time to be alive. The turn of the millennium was seriously the best time to be a kid. New Year's Eve 1999 was the first time I was actually allowed to stay up until midnight to watch the year change. And we had what felt like a million billion fireworks ready to fire off. And my dad and our friends' parents even got us all very fancy outfits to wear and drink sparkling grape juice in a formal evening party like the grown-ups we saw on TV. But while we were having a blast, tons of other people were seriously freaking out. Reason number billion and one why it's better to just be a kid in the 90s. Because with the information age and computers and the internet came fears about the turn of the date to January 1st, 2000. All of those computers created in the 80s and 90s were created with code designs that abbreviated the years into 2 digits, like 97 instead of 1997, in order to save space on the computers, since they essentially had the memory capacity of a small USB drive today. But then they realized as we crept closer to the new millennium that there would be a problem with the 00 date. Would the computer think that it was 2000 or 1900? And so the fear was that when the computer struck midnight, all of the computers would freeze and break, which sounds like not the worst problem, like you can fix that. But you have to remember that computers at this point are in literally everything. They're not just in our houses, they're in our cars and planes. They run basic things like communication, and they're the basis of the banks and stock exchanges that literally run the entire global economy. And it wouldn't just be our computers, it would be all computers. So the fear is that the world would literally just shut down. So that's a problem. Now, the government doesn't take this lightly, because obviously if everything falls apart, we're totally going to blame them for that. And Clinton is already in like 10 tight spots. So they pump billions of dollars into software patches that will fix the problem. And it does get fixed, so when the clocks turn, everything is fine. Which then leads to a lot of people like, that's it? And so some people start to ask if there was really a crisis at all. And the answer is probably. Like, obviously, we don't know the extent that things would have been a catastrophic mess without the patches and fixes, because we didn't let that happen. But we can't allow ourselves to look at a situation where the government steps in and fixes something and then automatically assume, well, clearly it wasn't a problem then. Like, no, that just means that the solutions we came up with probably worked. The questions we really need to ask moving forward are more diagnostic. What percent of those fixes actually went to actively fixing the problem? And what can we do to prevent needing emergency fixes like this in the future when it comes to critical systems that hold up literally the entire planet's economic infrastructure? Trends in the music industry also dominated the pop culture scene of the 90s, and really shockingly, these particular trends were pretty long-lasting. The first is what I'm going to describe as the mass production of the boy band. Now, boy bands as a general concept aren't totally new. I mean, we've had groups like the Temptations and the Beatles and such with fangirls fawning over them since the post-World War II era. So in the sense that the music industry has been able to get small groups of attractive dudes together and make them sing, this is not a new thing. But in the 90s, it's like every music producer in America woke up one morning and was like, hey, what if we took that idea and did it this way? And so what we had were like a million groups of 4 to 5 good-looking dudes, minus ridiculous wardrobe issues, with moderate to good voices who can sometimes dance. And then about 1 billion fangirls like me beating each other up at the Radio Shack trying to buy their new album when it came out. Just kidding, my aunt worked at the Radio Shack, so I never had to wait. But in a twist of fate, or again, the music industry, inevitably, like every time, you'd get one guy from the group who would decide to leave and the group would break up. Boyz II Men broke up when Michael McCary left due to health problems. Jonathan Knight left New Kids on the Block because they got tired of working in the entertainment industry. They paved the way for groups like NSYNC and Backstreet Boys, who each broke up when Justin Timberlake left NSYNC and Kevin Richardson left Backstreet Boys to do other things. And then B2K broke up when Omarion decided to launch a solo career. But the love for these groups lasted so much longer than their love for each other. Several of the groups, like Boyz II Men, New Kids on the Block, and the Backstreet Boys, have launched reunion tours in the decades after their breakup, and original fans dish out major money to attend their concerts. Even more than that, though, music producers know that this is a model that works. As long as there are 4 to 5 moderately talented guys that can sing up on a stage, there will be thousands of fans willing to toss money at their merchandise. And so this led to more boy bands in the 2000s, like the Jonas Brothers, One Direction, and now the emergence of a vast K-pop fan base. In addition to boy bands, we also had girl groups. It's important to realize that you're not choosing between loyalties here. You're equally obsessed with all of these groups. So the 2 biggest girl groups for young people in the 90s were arguably the Spice Girls and Destiny's Child. There were also obviously solo female artists like Sheryl Crow, Christina Aguilera, Brandy, Britney Spears, Avril Lavigne, etc., but these are the girl groups. So the Spice Girls are essentially the new and woman version of the British invasion. So if the 60s gave us the Beatles, the 90s gave us them. And for the most part, conservative parents hated them because their stage clothes were almost non-existent. But each of the Spice Girls had a name and a theme. So you had Mel B, Scary Spice, Victoria Beckham, Posh Spice, Emma Bunton, Baby Spice, Mel C, Sporty Spice, and Jerry Halliwell, Ginger Spice. And so if you're a younger girl, you're spending half your time obsessing over which of these Spice Girl personalities you personify. I was Sporty Spice, in case anyone is wondering. The Spice Girls had a movie that came out in 1997, but then sort of slowly fizzled out after that. Except Victoria Beckham, who's still all up in the spotlight because she's married to David Beckham and friends with like half the royal family. The other group we have is Destiny's Child, which the world owes a great debt of gratitude to because this is the origin of the queen, Beyoncé. On top of all of their killer vocals, Destiny's Child was always getting publicity for their amazing coordination of outfits, both when it came to music videos and award shows. They also just had a series of amazing singles that played like non-stop on MTV and the radio, like Bootylicious and Survivor. But like all great groups, the individual members eventually decided to pursue solo careers around like 2001. In the world of rap, the 90s saw one of the most tragic music feuds in our history. Tupac and Biggie started off their music careers in drastically different parts of the country. Tupac was raised by a single mother in California and released his first album in '91 after working as a dancer in the music industry. On the other side of the country in Brooklyn, Biggie spent the better part of his teenage years dealing drugs and rapping for fun while he attended, perhaps loosely, the same high school eventually attended by Jay-Z. But his side hobby was clearly a talent. A demo he made was picked up by Sean Combs, otherwise known as Puff Daddy, who offered to represent him and released his first album in 1993. By the time Biggie entered the music scene, Tupac's career had already taken off, so he arranged for an introduction. This led to the two becoming friends, hanging out together when they were in the same area and crashing at each other's places when they were on the right side of the country. Because remember, Tupac was based on the West Coast and Biggie was in the East. And because Tupac was so successful, Biggie asked him at one point to take over as his manager, but Tupac wasn't really one to mix with business with his friendships, so he advised Biggie to stay with Puff Daddy. Biggie was obviously not super thrilled by this, but it wasn't like the end of the world. The biggest breaking point in their relationship came in 1994 when Tupac was shot in the lobby of the Quad Recording Studios in New York. He was literally on his way up to work on a project with Biggie when it happened and assumed that he had something to do with it. This paranoia, whether it was founded or not, only grew while Tupac was in jail in 1995. When he was released from jail, it was because the record company Death Row Records posted his bail. Death Row Records was a rival company to Puff Daddy's record company, so when Tupac signed with them, he was essentially declaring open war against Biggie and Puff Daddy in the industry and in the streets. This rivalry was super obvious in their music. Biggie released a single, Who Shot Ya, which led to Tupac releasing Hit 'Em Up. In September 1996, an unknown gunman shot Tupac 4 times in the chest in Las Vegas. After this, Biggie made statements that he thought it was time to stop the East versus West Coast fighting. 6 months later, he was murdered at a stoplight in Los Angeles. Neither murder has ever been solved. Just like in music, the world of television experienced changes in the 90s that were more expansions of previous trends than really earth-shattering creations, but they did make the messages of these trends more available to wider audiences. Just like a lot of entertainment we've talked about, late-night television shows aren't new by any means. The Tonight Show, for example, started in the early 50s as a nighttime variety show of artists and comedians. For decades, late-night TV programs were a way for Americans to unwind at the end of the day and hear the news and other points of interest in a relaxed and even comedic way. It's meant to be a way for the country to exhale. And so in the 90s, what we get are really just more people doing this. And this makes sense because with the emergence of things like cable in the 80s and now more channels than ever, we've got more platforms for people to do this on. And with the emergence of the 24-hour news cycle, there's also more news to make fun of, more people to bring on as guests, and more skits to make out of new information. And this lines up with our political revolution we know is happening as well. As Republicans and Democrats become increasingly unfriendly towards each other, the various channels that have partisan bends to them, which some do more than others, tend to have late night shows with skits that bend their humor in one direction or another. And so then people tune into the channel that best fits their personality and interests. That's not to say that all of these shows are political talk shows. In fact, many of them only focus on politics in a minor or tangential way. A lot of them are focused on more social or pop culture news events. But if you spend your entire day watching ABC, you'll probably be inclined to watch whatever late night show comes on that channel in the evening. And media companies know this. So we see a wide growth of these types of late night programming all over and available. We also tend to see an expansion in the diversity of TV sitcoms. Prior to the 90s, sitcoms, which stands for situational comedies for those of you who don't know, have tended to portray African Americans in super stereotypical roles. So they tend to show African American men as laborers or even criminals. Black women are usually seen as maids or other domestic workers. And almost always they're speaking with some kind of weird southern accent or really terrible grammar. In the 80s, the first barrier to breaking this down was The Cosby Show, which showed the Huxtable family as an upper middle class family with really very traditional, pretty conservative values. The show tackled some issues surrounding civil rights and the portrayal of African Americans in white society, but the primary thing it did was show just the normalcy of Black American families as normal families. That Bill Cosby's character was a doctor, but also a father who had kids who sometimes did ridiculous things, and then he'd have to deal with those things. And so in the 90s, we have a whole series of new Black sitcoms that sort of follow in this path, some of which I have listed here, and push this dialogue a bit further. Living Single was groundbreaking because it centered Black women who were also professionals. And unlike other shows like Sex and the City, these women weren't constantly dealing with relationship drama and personal issues with each other. It was just a comedy that cast them as women with robust and complex backgrounds and then wrote the show around that. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air followed this by giving Will Smith's character a home with his aunt and uncle who were a professor and a judge. Really, the intro song gives away most of the series' plot. Will is from West Philly, but gets into a spot of trouble, so he moves in with his aunt and uncle and cousins to try and turn his life around. And so over the course of the series, we see him adjusting to a new living environment, i.e. one of ridiculous wealth, and navigating what his future will look like. And then the longest running sitcom featuring a Black family was Family Matters, which featured the now famous Urkel. In drastic contrast to Fresh Prince, this show features a working class family who sometimes struggle with making ends meet. In fact, one episode focuses entirely on the fact that Harriet, the mother, is fired after asking for a raise, which then goes on to show the realities of a modern family in America needing two incomes. The show also handles racism in the form of racial profiling, gun violence, and racial slurs. Obviously, these sitcoms and others like them were a step forward in creating equity and media representation for African Americans in the United States, one that needed to be matched in other areas of the media as well. But one of the biggest criticisms of these shows, and shows still today, is that they represented a certain form of respectability politics within the Black community, or the idea that the only kinds of Black families that should be represented on TV were ones like the Huxtables or Will's aunt and uncle, wealthy or middle-class conservative valued families. Black families who look and dress and act a certain way. The only two sides of the Black population in America that can exist in media representation are criminals or uptight Ivy League types. And by representing the Black community in these two opposite spectrums, American media leaves out the vast majority of African Americans in this country. Because as I've said what feels like a million times by now, no group is a monolith. Nobody is all one thing. Comparably, the 90s was an incredible time for American pop culture in terms of diversity and type of representation. And the trends that started in that decade really only took off with increasing speed in the 2000s with faster technology and increased globalization.